Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And I remember opening night of Attack of the Clones. It was like, 2001? Something like that? It's probably close. Whatever the case, it was long before the age of controversies about how bathrooms should be labeled and who should use which one. And I don't know, people can think about that, whatever they want. That's not the point of this conversation. The point of this conversation is to set it in a moment in time so that you know that back in those days, there was no argument. Dudes went to the one bathroom and ladies went to the other bathroom. And so we go to this retro theater. Retro is not the right word. It was a classic theater. That's the term. It was in downtown Grand Island, Nebraska. It had been restored to its former glory and volunteers ran the place, and we're going to see Attack of the Clones. So it's packed. Everybody's excited. And there's this little lobby. Everybody's jammed in there getting concessions and everything. I'm there with a bunch of my friends. My friend Steve was there. And my buddy Jeremy was there, who can be a very determined, very direct person at times and who doesn't like to fool around very much. And so we're all getting our sacks and everything, hustle into the bathroom to get things good to go. So I go into the bathroom labeled men because, that would be where I would go. And my wife at the same time went into the bathroom labeled ladies because that would make sense for her. And so she's in there. And I come out of the bathroom a minute later, and then she comes running out of the bathroom with her eyes wide open. She's like, Matt. What? Jeremy is in the women's bathroom and he doesn't know it. Like, I just saw somebody in there with their feet pointed the wrong way in one of the stalls, and he was complaining like, oh, Whitman, I guess they can't even afford urinals in here. And so I didn't know what to do, so I just ran out. I'm like, what, he's in there right now? And she's like, yeah. And so I don't know what came over me, but it seemed totally socially appropriate in that moment to raise my hand in the crowded lobby full of people I didn't know and declare, could I have your attention, please, theater? In just a moment, my dear friend Jeremy is going to emerge from the women's restroom he just used unwittingly. Let's make sure to let him know that we noticed. And everybody's laughing and they're along for the ride. And sure enough, Jeremy comes out of there and is like, oh, okay, what are we doing? We're going to go see the movie. And everybody starts like laughing at him and applauding and stuff. And finally I explained, he's like, I don't care. Whatever, I don't care. And he just went and sat down. We had a nice night. It was fun watching the show, even if it wasn't the best Star Wars has to offer. In that moment and in that relationship, I obviously had a decision to make. Do I keep this thing discreet and we all just have a private laugh about it? Or is it going to be funnier and more fun? And is that guy going to be able to handle it if we just do the whole thing publicly? Which is going to be more effective for my ends? And obviously, I chose to go public with it. Likewise, in Matthew chapter 23, we're in a place where Jesus has the option to keep his entirely justified and ordained statements of judgment against the religious leadership of his day. He could keep all of that stuff to himself like he has been doing, or just communicating it more privately with his disciples. Or he can gather the attention of the room, please, and finally just spell the whole dang thing out in front of everybody, and he opts for the latter. Matthew 23:1, then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So right off the bat, it's really interesting to note that he's acknowledging some sort of Jewish notion of apostolic succession. And I suppose high church folks, people associated with Western Catholicism, headquartered in Rome, or Eastern Orthodoxy, might look at that and be like, oh yeah, that is one of the precedents that we would look at to say that some sort of spiritual authority gets handed down from one religious leader affirmed by God to the next religious leader, and then that's how they speak with some kind of unique authority from God. I suppose the Protestant or any Christian who would reject that notion of apostolic succession embraced by Catholics and Orthodox would look at that and be like, well, yeah, except what's happening here is that this is demonstrating how absolutely broken that can be. And what Jesus is acknowledging is how they hold themselves out as being the keepers of the torch, the carriers of the baton from Moses, but how much of a fraud that actually is. Ultimately, that theological aside, that theological debate is not going to be settled looking at a passage like this. I just want to fairly acknowledge how this is going to read depending on whatever presuppositions you come to the text with. Whatever you might do with it, it looks like at minimum Jesus is playing along with the idea that they really do sit in Moses' seat. Now, this term Moses' seat is one that we know extra biblically was used all over the place for this teaching seat at the front of synagogues. Synagogues aren't really an Old Testament concept, or at least for most of the Old Testament. You wouldn't have had a synagogue. You just would have had the temple as the main place where people would have worshipped. I mean, why would you worship somewhere else? In the Old Testament, God lives in the temple. The sacrifices happen at the temple. And obviously that is still in place here in the Second Temple era, that being the temple that was fancied up by Herod the Great and put in place after the exile by the work of the people associated with Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament. If you don't know all those details off the top of your head, if that's a little unfamiliar, don't worry about a thing. Those are details we can connect later on. But the temple was the heartbeat of the Jewish religion. This is where the connection with God occurred. And the temple had a very exclusive monopoly on pretty much all of the spiritual life of the Jewish people until the 6th century BC, when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians defeated Jerusalem and effectively terminated the line of kings, or suspended the line of kings who had ruled from there, took them into captivity in modern-day Iraq, Babylon, Baghdad. And in that century and the centuries that followed, the Jewish people are scattered. It's called the diaspora, and they're sent all over the world to all these different places. Now, some of those scattered Jewish people who were scattered by the Assyrians or the Babylonians or whomever move on from whatever their ancestors had believed about the God of Abraham. Others really did not move on, and a whole other tradition develops. It's still Judaism, it's still Bible, but it's like a distinctly Babylonian version of that. It's a distinctly Alexandrian or Northern Egyptian version of that. And these other expressions of Judaism, they're not like a flash in the pan. We're talking at the time we get to Jesus about stuff that's existed longer than the United States of America. And so if you can think about how well established, like say, American culture and history is, well, that's how well established these different regional expressions of Judaism were by the time we get to Matthew chapter 23. And so if you're that far away and you can't make the trip to the temple, or you're that far away and there just is no temple at that time, what are you supposed to do? How do you reflect on the scriptures and the law and all the things that go into the spiritual life of the Jewish person? Well, you have synagogues. These are outposts, extensions, franchises. Nah, it's too crass a word. Don't count that one officially. But I think you get what I'm saying. These local incarnations of Judaism that center around these synagogues, in a way, are kind of the forerunner of church. And a big part of what you do there is you read the law, you reflect on the law, you examine the scriptures. There might be some discussion or debate about what you actually do in response to that kind of thing. And the idea that each of these synagogues has a seat where someone who is descended from the intellectual, moral, philosophical, legal tradition of Moses sits is something that was very widespread. So when Jesus says this, he's not just making a theological proclamation about how Moses handed off his authority. As much as anything, he's using the term that has been used there probably for centuries at this point, but awakening in people what that term alludes to. They're speaking with the authority of Moses, or that's how they hold themselves out. So that's kind of a big deal. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you. Now, the way I just read that tonally could make it sound like Jesus is being a little tongue-in-cheek here, like, oh, it's Moses, you better do that. And maybe that's what he meant. Or maybe he's really acknowledging the authority of that seat. And like, no, this has been the baton holder for a few hundred years of this thing that God is doing. The whole redemptive plan has been articulated and repeated right there from the seat of Moses. Yeah, you should listen to that. Yeah, you should do what they say. I could see how smart people could read that either way in terms of what Jesus is doing there tonally. And it's also easy for me to imagine what images and stories, even the name Moses, would evoke in the minds of the original audience. Everybody knew Moses. I mean, more than everybody knows Babe Ruth in our culture, Michael Jordan or LeBron James, like the biggest, most famous sports figures or actors. Like everybody knew Moses. Everybody knew all the stories inside and out, every single detail. There's nothing comparable in our culture in terms of how conversant everybody would have been with their story. I don't even think Jesus is as famous in our Western culture right now as Moses was in this more ethnically homogenous culture that we're looking at in Matthew chapter 23. The point is, everybody knows Moses. Everybody knows everything about Moses. Probably most people who were standing there could just quote and repeat everything that had to do with Moses from memory. And so at the mention of Moses, you're getting someone who is a celebrated rock star, but everybody would also remember that Moses stubbed his toe a few times. At times, Moses didn't use his power exactly right. He got frustrated. He got emotional. He's not God. And so maybe some people in the crowd hearing about this are like, yeah, they do sit in Moses' seat. And well, don't they sit in Moses' seat? Because Moses' seat wasn't always perfect either. And these guys, well, they're certainly not perfect. Well, Jesus goes on to affirm whatever suspicions people had about where this speech is going. And so at this point, what Jesus is saying about the synagogue and the authority that goes along with it and Moses' seat and the Pharisees' role, like the first two sentences sound pretty good. The Pharisees are maybe like, oh, I don't know where this is going, but so far this is fine. And then the next phrase that we're going to look at next time around is where it really takes the turn we've been alluding to now for a week or so. So in the same way that I got everybody's attention in the theater and started talking about my friend, and at first people were probably like, what's going on? Are we celebrating something? That's the tone people use when we're going to celebrate something. Is this somebody's birthday? Are we all going to sing? And then it quickly pivoted to, oh, yikes. No, that's kind of embarrassing. So that's what I think is happening here. Jesus gets everybody's attention. That initially sounds like he is affirming the authority or the potential for good of the Pharisees, the synagogue system, the seat they teach from. But then as we're going to see tomorrow, just like in the movie theater incident, it's going to pivot towards something a little less positive. The ratings and reviews that you are leaving on whatever apps you listen to this podcast on are wildly helpful and fun and encouraging. I like how creative some of you are with that. I do read every single one of those. They're particularly helpful when you put them on iTunes, and I've noticed more of those come in lately. Thank you. It's weird. I see a little bump in terms of how many people participate every time, even a few, like 2 or 3 reviews make that big of a difference. So I don't know if it's weird that I keep bringing it up, but I'm excited about it, and it means a lot to me. So thank you. More on Matthew 23 next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.